A great number of people are renters, and of these people, many are also only able to live paycheck to paycheck. So being unable to work because of quarantine protocols or sickness is a big problem. A sane system, unlike capitalism, would have realized that it is in the interests of public health to keep as many people as possible away from one another and through social gathering, but also to realize that in order to do so, these people need material support. For many of us, the problem is rent. Without being able to pay your rent because you can't work or work safely, you run the risk of being evicted. This video is about one potential solution to this, the rent strike. First, before I go on, let me say that your first line of attack should be to ask your landlord if they will accept a reduced rent or stoppage of rent because of the pandemic. While I tend to despise landlords on principle, not all of them are as vile as many of them tend to be. Rent strikes, depending on where you are, might also not be legal or legally recognized under the law. Again, all I'll say is that it isn't a crime to evict people during a pandemic, and that laws can be very easily unjust. Part 1. So what is a rent strike, and how can it help you? Well, a rent strike is just where the renter, or tenant, refuses to pay rent to their landlord until certain demands are met. Usually, a rent strike is done because the landlord has not maintained the building and the tenants live in unsafe conditions, but, importantly, they still pay the value of their full rent. Right now, a rent strike could be done to get a reduced rent, or a temporary stoppage of rent payments due to the pandemic. It shouldn't be the case that you should have to continue to pay your rent if you can't continue to work safely. Most people don't have enough savings to survive such an emergency, but our capitalist system is just that exploitative. Part 2. So, why would a rent strike work? Well, just like a normal strike by workers, a rent strike targets the thing that the landlord actually cares about, namely, their profits. By withholding the rent payments, but still occupying the house, you are directly hurting the landlord's profits, and thus far more likely to get them to react than, say, if you just asked them nicely, or even tried an expensive legal method. The landlords want your rent, and they don't like disruptions to their relatively easy money. One person going on a rent strike is unlikely to do much, however. That single person is easy to evict or to take legal action against. But if everyone in the building participated in the strike, it would be far more difficult to evict them all, and the costs of a legal battle rise dramatically, not to mention the loss of income to the landlord. There's strength in numbers. One person out of 100 is an easy target, but getting all 100 people out of the building would be much more difficult, especially now. Furthermore, replacing the renters during the pandemic would also be difficult, so the landlord would not only lose money in removing people, they would also lose money while the building is sitting unused. The threat of a rent strike, and the loss of incomes it entails, is enough that in many cases the landlords would rather avoid a big fight and take a more certain surety of payment later than gamble and lose a lot more now. After all, you aren't doing this for no reason. Being unable to work due to sickness or fear of it should be a legitimate reason to not have to pay your rent. Part 3. So how would you do it? Well, as mentioned, rent strikes work best in groups. Talk to as many tenants as you can, if you can, and draw up a formal agreement along with a demand, like a rent stoppage. Elect someone in charge of managing your responses to management of the landlord, and make sure that no one pays their rent until you get an adequate response. In older times, rent strikers would collect all their rent checks together and keep them safe from the landlord, but nowadays most people probably pay via EFT. You have to help each other out. You need to be able to outlast the landlord. That means sharing food or utilities if the landlord tries to cut you off from services. Planning the strike out beforehand is vital. Figuring out what you can and cannot do if the landlord doesn't give in is super important. Take to social media. The more attention you can get on your landlord and their treatment of you, the better. If they're being outed as being particularly callous in this time, it increases the chances that social pressure will help them cave to your demands. Lastly, you need to prepare for the repercussions. A rent strike is unlikely to go down well with the landlord even if you do win. And remember, this is a last-ditch resort. Not being homeless during the pandemic is what you are trying to aim for. This is why I specified that you should ask first before you go on strike. Afterwards, the landlords would likely not want to renew your leases or probably try to evict you anyway. Good luck to you all. Be safe, everyone.